according to the IMF, the economy of Sub-Saharan Africa will probably expand by 6.1%, the fastest pace of any region in the world after emerging Asia, fueled by China's demand for gold, copper and oil. With that, the US government and private equity companies are seeking to catch up in Africa. For more on the investment opportunities on the continent, I'm joined by Ashley Bendel, African Investment Advisor. Ashley, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Let's start broadly and look at US-Africa relations. Have these changed in any way or shifted over time? And if so, what is the US's mode of engaging with Africa now?
Sure. Well, if we take a step back to the last administration, George Bush himself worked on the AGOA program, the African governmental approach towards building trade and investment between the US and Africa. That is now in about its 10th year and has been broadly successful. If you fast forward to just a couple of months ago, President Obama obviously travelled to the continent, to Senegal, South Africa and to Tanzania. And what we've seen now in his second term is him really ratcheting up his approach in assisting trade once more in Africa, more broadly within the infrastructure sector, with his plans under Power Africa, as it's been called.
As Africa has taken off with 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world right now, do you believe that corporate USA has also changed their mode of engaging with the continent? And what does this really look like? Are we seeing a change in strategy and a change in business models as against traditional approaches that maybe American corporations used in Africa?
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen a pickup in interest, but remember that's from a low base. We've seen companies entering across the continent quite aggressively in the shape of General Electric. We've also seen Walmart enter via Massmart in South Africa, and their entry into the continent via South Africa itself. You're seeing companies like Coca-Cola setting up their offices in East Africa. You're seeing Google obviously really entering the ICT space quite aggressively and setting up major offices in some of the larger countries. But I still think we're quite early in that regard. I would say that most of that corporate interest is coming from South Africa at this stage, but we are seeing more interest, and you will see that in Chicago next month in the States with the Corporate Council on Africa event. You will see over 100 US corporates looking to do business with African countries and their representatives, which will be quite reflective.
Let's bring this down a little bit to private and public equity in particular. What are the major trends that you feel are being thrown out when you look at those flows between the US and Africa?
Sure. Well, we've seen, if we take it private then public, there's certainly been a lot more interest post-crisis. Building up towards today. In the private equity world, there were a handful of sizable, billion-dollar African-focused firms, one in DC in particular, that had launched. We've seen KKR and Carlyle, 2 major US private equity firms, launching product and looking more closely. You're also seeing a number of smaller firms with sector-focused, launching both in country and in the United States and elsewhere. It's certainly ratcheting up. From what I hear in the private equity world, people, those bigger funds are looking at larger infrastructure projects.
Right.
There's a lot of opportunity within the $5 to $20 million space and not enough money to chase it. Right. I think the problem that we have is we need the endowment space, the pension fund, the family office world to connect more with them, and they're starting to do that. From a public equity perspective, we're seeing more and more launches of sub-Saharan products and frontier products around the world, out of South Africa, out of Europe. I focus more so on the United States. There's been a big trend towards sub-Saharan and frontier launches. But more interestingly, what's been driving these markets up to a large extent has been foreign inflows to those funds, but also larger emerging market funds and emerging market small cap funds, which now have the mandate to invest in smaller companies in sub-Saharan Africa.
As you've alluded to, it seems as if South Africa still does enjoy the lion's share of equity flows from the US. But as the Africa growth story goes bigger than South Africa, I'm sure there are other countries or other markets that are coming into the radar. Can you give me an indication of some of the ones that are fastest off the mark that are really getting sort of American interest?
Well, from 2 perspectives. Firstly, South Africa gains great interest due to its inclusion in the MSCI Emerging Market market index. With the MSCI Frontier Index, including Nigeria, Kenya, Mauritius, and a couple of others coming through, that's drawing a lot of interest by virtue of being part of an index which many focus on from a public perspective, and that will continue to be the case as those markets develop in a number of ways. From a private equity perspective, I think it's the usual big countries that are growing fastest, as you alluded, and that are the largest on the continent: Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, and the East African community, and some countries in Southern Africa as well.
Ashley, quickly before I let you go, what needs to be done to enhance the flows between Africa and the US? And this is not only for South Africa, but the broader continent.
No, I just think the discussion needs to continue, and there needs to be interest from both parties to sit down and do that. I've been fortunate to host and sit down with some senior officials from the continent and with ambassadors in the United States. And their conversation is becoming a smarter one, and one which is moving towards actioning their plans. So I think we're starting to see that.